Hello and welcome to a somewhat new Ukraine war update. Today, our main focus will be on the intense Second Battle of Kupiansk, which has silently turned into one of Ukraine's biggest recent successes on the battlefield. If you appreciate the effort I put into this video and want to support me and my channel, please consider supporting it with a like and a comment. It really helps me a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And as always, the full version of this video, including uncensored footage, can be found on my Telegram channel. The link is in the description. While the first clearly documented confrontation in the city appeared on social media in November 2025, which surfaced in the form of this video that shows helmet camera footage of Ukrainian special forces engaged in urban combat, Russian troops had already regained a foothold in the city in late September after they had previously been driven out by Ukrainian forces during the First Battle of Kupiansk in 2022. The men shown here, who were from the 8th Regiment of the Special Operations Forces, were on a reconnaissance mission when they came into contact with Russian forces that had fortified themselves inside a building. Due to this and the fact that the Russians had numerical superiority, they decided to break contact, which they successfully managed without sustaining any losses. At the time this video was released, the city was largely under the control of Russian forces, which had already occupied large parts of the area by late October through the infiltration of small assault groups. A tactic that had previously produced slow and costly gains in other sectors of the front. This map from the Ukrainian military shows the situation toward the end of October 2025, before Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack from the northwest shortly afterward in order to close in onto the city again. But before the city could be assaulted, a number of surrounding towns and small settlements had to be cleared of Russian troops in order to secure the advance. Due to the heavy saturation of the battlefield with drones on both sides, however, a large portion of the fighting took place in wooded areas. These forests gave Ukrainian infantry a certain degree of freedom to maneuver, but they also provided Russian forces with cover and potential fallback positions. This led to a series of intense engagements, one of which I will now show you to give you an impression of the severity and intensity of the fighting. A short disclaimer: the fighting you are about to see is very intense, and the Ukrainians suffered several wounded in action during this engagement, so I had to cut parts of the footage. If you want to see the full uncensored version, check out my Telegram channel. After the successful recapture of Radkivka and Mirny, Ukrainian forces were able to push into the city and, by mid-December, regain control of 90% of it following heavy urban fighting. A high priority for the Ukrainians was to take the city council building in the center of the city to demonstrate control over Kupiansk, and that is exactly what happened. In January 2026, the Kartia Brigade released a video showing Ukrainian fighters securing the city center as well as the city council building after heavy urban close-quarters combat. Through the battles of Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Toretsk, the Ukrainian armed forces were able to gain significant expertise not only in drone warfare but also already learned costly lessons in terms of high-intensity urban combat. But this time it was different. Instead of taking on the role of the defenders, fighting a delaying action against a demographically and numerically superior enemy, they were now the ones on the offensive. In coordination with drones, they handled the situation quite effectively. When a lone Russian soldier was spotted through a window as he tried to get a better overview of the situation, Ukrainian drone pilots immediately engaged both him and the building in order to support the advancing infantry. The high volume of strike drones not only disrupted and fixed the Russians inside, but also had a suppressive effect that created a window of opportunity for the Ukrainians to assault the building and enter close-quarters combat. Normally, advancing across this open ground would be a nightmare for any soldier, as it is open ground in the middle of urban terrain. That means no cover for the advancing forces, but deep cover and several potential interlocking fields of fire for the defenders. The FPV drones therefore not only functioned as strike weapons but also as enablers that allowed the Ukrainians to storm the building, engage the Russians at close range, clear the structure, and raise both the Ukrainian flag and the flag of their unit. However, the battle for the city was not over. The Ukrainians still had to clear the surrounding areas, as numerous Russian infiltrators remained barricaded inside buildings. These positions had to be cleared by the Ukrainians in painstaking, urban fighting, requiring what can only be described as bloody infantry work. This required a brutal and aggressive approach in a setting where every doorway, stairwell, and shattered window became a potential threat axis. As a result, we see a high volume of fire, extensive use of both targeted and preemptive grenades, and classic recon by fire to provoke enemy movement and reveal firing positions. Civilians had already been evacuated from the city beforehand, which meant that the rules of engagement gave Ukrainian soldiers relatively free rein in choosing their clearing methods. The men, however, quickly drew the attention of a Russian FPV drone, and this is what happened next. Despite the detonation inside the building, the soldiers appeared largely unharmed, but they decided to leave the structure. The strike could only mean that a Russian observer drone had identified their position, forcing them to relocate. However, the street had already been turned into an effective kill zone, and it did not take long before a second FPV drone attempted once again to neutralize the Ukrainian troops. Fortunately for them, this attempt also failed. However, they were forced to withdraw deeper into the ruins of a destroyed building, where they once again became involved in close-quarters fighting. While it appears that the Katyia brigade carried the main burden of the ground combat, the fighters in its ranks were not only Ukrainians. In particular, there were several men from Latin America among them, including volunteers from Brazil and Colombia. If you've watched until now, I just want to say thank you. I hope you'll consider giving this video a like and leaving a comment about my analysis of the battle. You can't imagine how much every single like and comment helps me. Thank you. In the course of the previous reporting on the recapture operation of Kupiansk, a viral video from a somewhat authoritative source predominantly featured footage from the initial liberation of Kupiansk by the Kraken group in 2022, without clearly disclosing this fact. Since I do not really wish to leak or disclose any background information about the SOPs of certain actors here, I will not attribute any deceptive or malicious intent to the externally hired scriptwriters of that video or to the group that released it. Instead, I would simply state in good faith that this decision was likely driven by a combination of sensationalism and the limited availability of usable footage from the recent operation at the time of release, as most of the material from the hot phase of the newly conducted offensive was only released in 2026. In this context, I will now go over parts of several videos from the first liberation of Kupiansk during the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive in 2022 for clarification purposes. Although both battles were fought over the same city, they differed significantly in their execution and operational dynamics. The video I previously mentioned, which mixed these events together as if they were one, therefore unfortunately created a fundamentally misleading impression of how the recent operation was actually carried out. So consider this a bit of clarification and corrective context. I think the first thing that immediately stands out when watching this footage is that these men carried out a relatively confident, open, and exposed advance into the city, which differed significantly in execution from that of the Katyia brigade. They maneuvered with noticeable freedom under open skies and used streets without apparent hesitation, seemingly unafraid that their movement would be denied by an omnipresent network of observation and FPV drones. The reason for this is quite simple. Although the first small quadcopter drones had already begun to find their way into the ranks of primarily Ukrainian units at the time, they were not yet deployed on a large scale, and the Russians had not fully adopted this approach. This was also reflected in the way the men reacted to enemy contact, and especially in how and how long they maintained contact with the enemy out in the open. What we observe is a relatively two-dimensional approach that focused primarily on force-on-force engagements between ground troops, essentially infantry-on-infantry combat, at most extending to limited combined arms engagements. The sky above them was not given much attention on the tactical level at that time. This dynamic was largely a result of the full-fledged maneuver warfare taking place at the time, during which Ukrainian forces were actively pushing the Russians back. Although indirect fires were definitely a factor at the time, the Russian kill chain, meaning the full cycle of detecting a target, identifying it, transmitting the coordinates, assigning a firing unit, and delivering accurate artillery or missile strikes was not yet as well established, optimized, or adaptable as it would later become in the war. In the later stages of the conflict, this process became significantly faster and more integrated, particularly through the widespread use of drones and digital communication platforms that allowed near real-time target acquisition and strike coordination. However, more recently, this system appears to have been degraded again, partly due to restrictions such as the reported shutdown of Starlink access for Russian forces and measures like the Telegram ban, which disrupted parts of their digital command and control ecosystem. Based on these factors, the Ukrainians were not only able to maintain greater cohesion between their elements, but also to maneuver in larger formations than we typically see on the battlefield today. It can also be observed that, at that time, the city was still largely intact due to the maneuver-based nature of the fighting and did not have to be taken through the kind of painstaking, methodical urban close-quarters combat that we see today. Tactically, the Ukrainians were vastly superior to the Russians at that time, and the Russians committed a series of fatal mistakes. One particular incident shown here clearly illustrates just how much the Ukrainians had managed to surprise them. In this footage, Ukrainian fighters encounter a lone Russian soldier hiding in a toilet house and open fire at extremely close range. Naturally, this has to be blurred here on YouTube and can only be shown in full in the Telegram version. Perhaps I will go over the first battle for Kupiansk in more detail in a separate video, but believe me, there is much more to come in this one. One particularly impressive video, for example, shows slow-motion footage of Ukrainian forces shooting down a Russian Shahed drone with a minigun fired from a helicopter. The Russians once released an equally impressive, high-quality video showing the interception of a drone using a Russian GSG minigun equipped with a Kretchet thermal imaging sight. In this video, a Ukrainian F-16 shoots down a Russian drone at close range using either an AIM-120 AMRAAM or an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile. There were conflicting reports about which missile was used, and I am not enough of a missile expert to say with certainty. Perhaps one of you can provide more insight in the comments about what was likely employed. The engagement was also recorded from another angle, so make sure to watch that as well, and feel free to discuss it in the comments. This archival video, filmed from the cockpit of a Ukrainian Su-25, shows the moment its wingman crashed after being shot down by Russian manpads. But this was nothing compared to this video, which shows another Ukrainian Su-25 recording itself being shot down by a Russian surface-to-air missile. As in the previous case, the pilot unfortunately did not make it. However, this was not the first case of a Ukrainian aircraft recording itself being shot down by enemy anti-air fire while flying at low altitude. Already in 2014, a Ukrainian helicopter captured the moment it was struck and brought down by a Russian anti-air missile. Back then I already had the video on my channel, but YouTube tricked me into deleting it together with all footage from the wars in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria and Afghanistan. More on that one day in a future video. This Russian soldier, who was riding in the back of a cargo truck, suddenly encountered a Ukrainian FPV drone approaching the vehicle and immediately opened fire. However, his attempt to intercept the drone failed, and it crashed directly into the open bed of the truck. The Russians instantly jumped out of the vehicle to avoid the expected detonation. Fortunately for them, the explosion did not occur, and the men escaped with nothing more than a massive scare. I have spoken before about the mud as the hidden side boss in Ukraine. And here we once again see a video that perfectly illustrates why the mud is such a frustrating and persistent enemy. This Russian National Guard soldier made the mistake of reflexively picking up a stun grenade during a training exercise, most likely intending to throw it back. This is what happened next.